The type 3 humanity, an intermediate type between the first two types of humanity, possesses the psychic characteristics of both. The reason for this is the incomplete recovery from the primary childhood psychosis in adolescence. What does incomplete recovery from the primary psychosis of the type 3 humanity mean? Of course, it means that the anxiety emotional intelligence achieved in the form of developed anti-anxiety tools is considerable but insufficient for a decisive recovery from the primary psychosis. We are dealing here with the borderline anxious emotional intelligence. That's the anxious emotional intelligence zone, which is higher than the low anxious emotional intelligence characteristic for people with the primary psychosis, type 1 humanity, but at the same time lower than the anxious emotional intelligence, which allows to get out of the primary psychosis in adolescence and to join the type 2 humanity, anxious emotional. The existence of an intermediate psyche between type 1 and type 2 humanity results from a very important phenomenon, namely, is the phenomenon of the transition zone in the anxiety emotional intelligence. It turns out that there is no limit value of the anxiety emotional intelligence that separates the type 1 humanity from the type 2 humanity. This is not a strict boundary, but a anxious emotional intelligence zone. And the intermediate anxious emotional intelligence values are too high to be type 1 humanity and too small to be type 2 humanity. This means that there is an intermediate personality type, type 3 humanity. The type 3 humanity, more common than one might expect, is a puzzling phenomenon. The personality of this type shows many surprising features and is not as ambiguous and easy to describe as the psyches of the other two humanities. First of all, it's surprising that it's possible to recover not entirely from the primary psychosis, but only partially. It seems to be contradictory to any logic. The logic says that either you have the psychosis or not. A bit of the psychosis is still the psychosis. This is one of the reasons why the type 3 humanity people are the ambiguous, elusive type of psyche. This type will therefore be both psychotic and anxious emotional. But here again, a problematic issue arises. For I have said many times in my lectures and books that psychosis excludes the anxiety, that it was the nature that invented the primary psychosis to replace the anxiety. Is it then for the primary psychosis and the anxiety possible to coexist? This may surprise some people, but I still maintain that the thesis about the impossibility of existence of the primary psychosis and the anxiety, but also the thesis that the type 3 people present a psyche with elements of both the primary psychosis and the anxiety. Contradiction? Only apparent. So, how is this possible? As many of my listeners have already probably guessed, in the case of the type 3 humanity people, there comes not to a simultaneous but alternating occurrence of the psychotic periods with the anxiety periods. This means that periodically, during stabilization, the psyche of the type 3 people recover from the primary psychosis and is able to deal with the anxiety by means of the available anxiety emotional intelligence. And in time of a mental overload, when the possessed anxiety emotional intelligence is not enough to face the anxiety, the psyche of the type 3 people returns to the state of the primary psychosis. Moreover, the psychotic mechanism may turn on not only periodically, but also casually, situationally, namely, only in certain circumstances and situations of an everyday life in which an anxiety attack breaks through the anxiety emotional intelligence defense. Once such a critical situation is over, the primary psychosis subsides. This situational psychosis can take several hours, minutes, or even seconds. Isn't that another and how beautiful confirmation of my theory of psychosis as a natural anti-anxiety mechanism? Because in such short moments, we have a very clear situation for all the interpretations and speculations. There is a sudden attack of anxiety in the moment of the psyche overload. And there is a natural response to the anxiety, the one written in the genes of all mankind, the primary psychosis. The anxiety attack passes away, and the psychosis passes away. There is no place here for any doubt. This is the most beautiful possible proof of my theory of the primary psychosis as a natural anxiolytic mechanism. We deal with such an episodic psychosis in all types of mental disorders, so far referred to as obsessive compulsive disorders. If we have an insufficient anxiety emotional intelligence, a sudden eruption of the anxiety triggers a natural psychotic response in the form of the episodic psychosis. The episodic psychosis usually takes the form of a psychotic ritual. Thus, the episodic psychotic situation may be, for example, triggered by locking the door, resulting in a ritualistically repeated checking and making sure that the door was actually locked. There is no doubt that in this case, we are dealing with the episodic psychosis. The psyche of the type 3 people presents in such a moment a definitive sign of a psychotic state, which is the functioning regardless the actual reality. It's a normal reality turning the key in the lock and checking once that the door is closed is enough to perform and verify the act of closing the door. Meanwhile, the type 3 person in such a situation experiences the anxiety attack, in front of which the anxiety emotional intelligence is helpless. By the type 3 people, a natural mechanism of decompression in the form of episodic psychosis turns on in such a temporary anxiety overload, and then the anxiety disappears. No one can doubt the psychotic nature of such a ritual. It meets the two basic criteria of the psychosis. First, a detachment from the reality, and second, substitution for the anxiety. Psychosis always replaces anxiety. Another example of the episodic psychosis in the anxiety, anxious emotional intelligence imbalance situation is the paroxysmal hand washing or washing clothes, etc. Of course, the rituals of the episodic psychosis are often extremely exhausting physically and mentally, but evidently, from the nature's point of view, it's a price worth paying to stop the anxiety. Apparently, the nature doesn't like the anxiety and fights it in every possible way. So, first the primary psychosis, then the episodic psychosis, then the negative primary psychosis, known so far as depression, and finally the complete exclusion of anxiety, which is the unipolar psyche, called so far as autism. The obsessive compulsive disorder, that's the episodic psychosis, has been so far, in an incomprehensible way, classified as an anxiety disorder in the psychiatric systematics. It is, however, as I have shown above, a psychotic disorder.